My name is Saray Johnson. I'm a staff librarian and instructor at the AIDS Library right across the way over there. And I think that the question of what the value of any oral history project is a good question, especially because it's an emerging tool. It's something that is still gaining steam as a method, and also something that's going to inform scholarship for generations to come. And I think that one of the ways that we can capitalize on and really make useful an oral history project is by making partnerships between universities and places that have funding and organizations that have this kind of resource among the folks that they serve, and also in their own archives. So I take care of some of the historical collections, some of the archival material over at the AIDS Library. And for us, as a library and not an archives, who's familiar with the difference between a library and an archives? Can you just raise your hand? Of course you are, Bob. But anyone else? So an archives can be public or private, but generally archives are concerned with the preservation. They're concerned with preserving records of enduring value, right? A library is interested in getting information to people at the right time. So sometimes the need of archiving versus the need of a library, they're not always exactly the same. And I think that oral histories are one place where an archive and a library can work together to both get the most out of a single resource, okay? And I think that Philadelphia is uniquely positioned to do that well, especially because of the emergence of these insurgent archives, right? So we have these archives of the impossible emerging. We have insurgent archives like the Interference Archive in New York, or the Trans-Oral History Project here in Philadelphia, among other places. So it's definitely a tool for people to go into their communities and talk to folks who might not have had any chance to share the information that's in their mind, and also to leave us with some lineages of activism for folks who are getting older, you know, and for folks who might have never been asked about what their experiences in the early parts of the AIDS epidemic were, and what their experiences were as human beings who were living during that time from various communities. So I think that there's definitely the opportunity for partnerships, but also there's a marketability that doesn't exist with a lot of other archival resources, right? Like it's something that people can see and experience in a very different way than a lot of things that are inside of our archives and libraries. So we have a chance for something to be marketable to just general folks who we want to be more interested in archiving, but also in the history of these movements.
So my name is Richman, and I am the manager of the AIDS Library, and I'm also a researcher. So my PhD is in sociology, and I've done a lot of qualitative interviewing with folks around sexuality, identity, and medical body types of issues. So on one hand, I'm thinking about this as a researcher and what are the benefits of a researcher to have something like this. However, in my role at the AIDS Library, I really am thinking deeply about what would it look like to have an oral history that was accessible to the folks who are in the library every day and the folks who are today living with HIV/AIDS, to kind of hear some of the stories of folks that came before them, folks who were also living with this, which I think would be, for me, a really central part of this project, to have it not be something that is only for research, although that's a great benefit as well, but also something that could be accessible in whatever way is agreed upon to folks in places like the AIDS Library or other kinds of community organizations. I think would be really exciting and important. And I'm really excited to be here to think about what role the AIDS Library can play, and that this project is being talked about at all. It's pretty exciting, particularly here in Philadelphia.
And I just want to say, as we're going down the line, the stuff that I'm hearing already, you mentioned quicker, people that haven't been asked before, people that we haven't heard from before. And you were saying about stories from people that people could look back and relate to in some way. And that gives a focus. And once again, the reason I'm picking that out is it's not saying to talk to providers again. I mean, not that there isn't a value in that, but that's what I'm hearing from your focus so far.
Hi, my name is Hershey Zinman, and I am the founder of the AIDS Library, Philadelphia. And I've been an activist since the early 80s. And I guess when I think of an oral history project, I think of how do you document best practices around collaboration, best practices around policy development, to look at a movement, a body, where we are, where we were, where we are going, not only for people who have been involved, so that they can tell their stories, and so we can look at best practices and get a historical perspective, but also so that people who have not been involved could actually look at the heart and soul of activism and see that whether it is HIV/AIDS now or another disease state or poverty or hunger or, there is actually an art form and a science to how problems are approached and how we come up with answers and how we come up with solutions. And so I kind of see Oral History Project as a way to glean all of those things. If it's specific to HIV/AIDS and AIDS activism and the AIDS movement in Philadelphia, then how do we glean those best practices and look at the collaborations, look at where we were, where we are, where we're going to, and then how to apply that to other movements.
And just a little more about best practice, what do you mean by best practices?
So what worked? There were a whole bunch of things that didn't work, and there were a whole bunch of things that did work. I know that for myself, looking at Tony's presentation, I started as a bartender in Philadelphia when people started dying. I worked behind a bar, and I got to see what was happening firsthand with my customers who were coming into the bar, and then I became involved as a buddy for the Philadelphia AIDS Task Force, and so if you fast forward, so I had my fingers, I had my hands in starting a bunch of organizations in Philadelphia, but then I actually went and joined, crossed over into the evil empire and joined pharma. And I was a community relations manager for DuPont Bristol Myers Squibb, where my responsibility was to work in communities, HIV positive communities, impacted communities, mostly people of color communities. And so I got to look at what worked in Philadelphia, what didn't work in Philadelphia, how to call upon community advisory boards and go into communities and talk to community members. And so when I talk about best practices, I talk about the things that I learned about if I'm walking into a community that doesn't look like me, what do I need to do to create trust, to open up a conversation and dialogue where people are receptive and open to some of the solutions that collectively we'll all come up with. And so that's what I mean when I talk about best practices.
Thank you.
My name is Tyrone Smith. I'm a long-time activist in Philadelphia around the issue of AIDS and other issues. I think for me, what it does is it begins to have a voice of Black community for me in the bigger picture and being a part of the process from the beginning. Most times we're asked into the process once the process has started. And I think that it is important if we're going to develop as a wholesome community that the contributions that African Americans make, living or dead, need to be documented the same as other individuals do, so that it is an equal playing ground if this community is going to change. And I think we often talk about change, and I think this, having an oral history, will help us change the community to the community that we wish to have. And I think this is an excellent beginning, because I can talk about young Black men who died, whose voices are no longer here, like Hal Carter, so many others that right now I cannot, but they're in my spirit, they're in me. And so that I think is what is important. The first time that there was a formal fundraiser for an African American individual, it was for a black bartender. So those are the things that so many people don't know. And I think it's important that that's a part of the community. Because we're not that harmonious community that we give off to be. We need to deal with those internalized things. Racism, sexism, and classism. And I think this is an excellent opportunity to move us forward as we move forward in this 2000 generation.
And I think you're getting at a lot of the points that I'm trying to make about what should be the focus. Because I can imagine for, almost anyone involved in the early, epidemic, I could talk to you for 20 hours. I could talk to you for an hour on this, an hour on this, an hour on that. We have to have some, if we were to do this project, we have to have some focus, the thread that goes through them all. So when we're sitting down, so if I was, if I was to spend an hour with you, what would I want to be asking?
For me personally, I think it's where I come from, who am I, what makes me me, what is it in the larger community that gives me a sense of belonging, and what is it in the larger community that makes me feel as an outsider. So many times people's body language and just the way people interact with other people, we have to accept the fact of what really is. Racism, classism still exists in the universe. And since we're part of that, we have to address it within our own community and how we begin to have those conversations.
Yeah, I think that the issue of marginalization and AIDS narratives are really, really important. One of the things that I think of, particularly in terms of our collaborations, and I mentioned this earlier, is the potential for a partnership with the Temporal Frame Project in Philadelphia, who I know is right now doing some work with the archives of William Way. So those collaborations already exist. But we already know that one of the things that the contemporary HIV movement does is consistently marginalize trans folks, right? We know that transphobia is a defining principle of what our community looks like right now in terms of, in service, people living with HIV, and we also know that Black trans women are living with the brunt of HIV and AIDS in our country. And because of that, and in some ways, everyone has sort of profited off of that, in the sense that trans women were consistently added into numbers of men who have sex with men erroneously for years and years and years. So there's the insult to injury, there's the oversight, and then there's the dual stigmatization of living a trans life and also living life as a sick person or a person who's living with HIV, right? So I think that if we're looking for places to prioritize, I think that the question is really who is being most impacted right now, right? Who should we have in the room should be exactly the same as who are the people who are going to be disproportionately dying from, who are going to be people who are disproportionately inconvenienced by and marginalized and oppressed because of HIV and AIDS. And that has to do with definitely class, it absolutely has to do with race, but it also has to do with gender identity, it has to do with sexual orientation too, and a lot of our different marginalizations. And also level of sickness and way of acquisition. There are so many hierarchies within sick and disabled communities that I think that only really oral history as art can sort of get to that. You let people talk and you get to a different thing than when you ask someone to write. And also, as a librarian and also someone who teaches literacy, I know that a lot of folks in our community, even though they might not say to themselves, they can't really read. And so when you go and you write these long articles and you put them in these different places, and then you forget that a lot of the folks who you're talking about wouldn't be able to read your article, It's not necessarily the same with an oral history. You can sit and you can watch an oral history on YouTube, which is one of the major strengths about the Trans Oral History Project. They're very accessible. You can get help if you want to access a video, particularly if it's in the library, right? So I think that there's real merit to oral history as a method to getting to the stories of people who are severely marginalized and multiply marginalized.
So I would love to hear from, please.
I appreciate the emphasis on the focus, and I think that's important. I'm also interested in the medium, and certainly if the archival material wants to be available to people that can't read, it has to be re-recorded, either a video recording or an audio recording. Also, archives are collected in writing as well. So I wonder if you've thought about what the actual medium might be for this project.
I can say I've given a fair amount of thought to it. That said, I keep going back to what do we want to accomplish? And you're right. If you want to accomplish what you're thinking, then you come up with perhaps video. I mean, video online is that you were talking about with the trans is phenomenal. And if you can do that, but also transcribe. And when we were thinking about it and budgeting at Drexel for doing some of this, we were thinking of definitely recording and transcribing and making the transcripts accessible. But we haven't thought about whether to do video or not. I think those are critical projects. It's one of John Cunningham's 14 things on here. But while we have everyone in the room, my concern keeps going back to, I want to hear more about what should be the focus of this. Yes.
Well, one thing that I'm thinking about is sort of the temporal frame. So, we could be interviewing people now who were around in the beginning so as not to lose that, or we could be interviewing people who are affected now, thinking in terms of the future, capturing that, or all of the above. And I mean, it seems to me that because the beginning was different, I mean, there was a lack of recognition, lack of funding, huge homophobia, blah, 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 that is a sort of a different moment to capture. I suppose every moment is different, but that strikes me because there was kind of nothing, and it was in the midst of that kind of homophobic era. So I'm just wondering how much you imagine focusing on the beginnings versus the here and now, let's say.
I think that one of the things is a beginning is a beginning. So for me, and I can only base it on me and my interaction, I remember when there was a time that we didn't come on this side of Market Street. I mean, we just didn't do it. Clubs that we went to basically were on the other side of Market Street. There were places that we went. And so now that integration has taken place. And for me, when I joined as a volunteer for the Philadelphia AIDS Task Force, that's when I met Ashley. And so we were able to build relationships across racial lines and to have that kind of conversation. I think the other thing is that the progress and the young people that we lost in the early days of the epidemic, to talk about them, but also to where we are now, and I agree with that. So what has the progress been? So that we start to see levels of progress that we've made as a community, and to where we want to go. I think the beginning is the beginning, then there's the middle, and then you have those folks that are living and dealing today to have those voices as well. So that it's not just them, those, and them. It becomes a us as a community. If we're going to build community, and it seems like the disease is not going anywhere, but if we're going to still build, even if it goes away, how do we build as a community so that we don't keep in every generation making the same mistakes?
So I just wanted to say that, I always get back to best practices and funding. And funding. So who's funding this? If we want to get funding we want to get funding for archives. We want to know the history of. Okay, that's one funding stream. But if we want to look at impacting behavior, we know what was in 1984. There were really hard lessons that we learned about community building, about racial politics, the racial politics of AIDS. What did we learn from that, and how do those lessons that we learn impact how we go forward? So if we're putting together a project and we want to impact these communities, there's pretty much a way to get those communities to the table, to ask those questions, to build consensus, to figure out what the project's going to look like, to get the most buy-in from those communities most impacted. So it's good to know what those lessons were, because we did it successfully, not so successfully back in the 80s and early 90s. But now we're, it's like 2015, okay? So what were the lessons that we learned, and how can we use that information to go forward? And so I think if it's to impact the future, we want to look at now. If it's to impact, if it's just to study history, how movements are built, then, let's look at what happened in 1982 and 1984. But that's not as, that's...
But I still think you could, there's a lot of questions, I want to get these questions rather than hear myself, but I think you can, in theory, look back and ask about what's going on in 1984 in a way that informs the present, because the people that went through it, you learned a lot, and you're saying, okay, I can actually help someone so they don't have to.
Absolutely, but I just want to say that, you can look at archives to look at the past.
Right.
And you can look at archives and study archives to figure out the future. And so I think it's the purpose of the archive in terms of, are we looking towards the future, or do we just want to study the past?
The future. Yes, which is good across the back. 1, 2, 3. Yes, 1, 2, 3.
The purpose is really sort of what's sort of problematic here. Because if you want to do sort of document the past, if you really want a history, and you want a different kind of history, this is moral history, people who actually experienced it, hear it in the words. And whenever you read an oral history or hear an oral history, there's real value in that, because there's lifelong knowledge. It's not someone just writing history. It has a very different kind of impact. And that's pretty sort of straightforward. If you want to influence what's going to happen, or what's happening now, AIDS is a very different, commodity now than it was 10 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago. And one of the problems, having been involved in prevention efforts at some point in the early 2000s, once AIDS became a quote-unquote manageable disease, the whole ballgame changed. Kids and even adults, even people who were alive back then, have a very different perspective on unsafe things, high bottom, etc. And so there's a question, if you're really looking about what happens in goes on the future, how much do all these incredible stories about the past really impact that? Because the ball game is so different now.
But I think that can actually be a good thing to think it through what you're saying. I know your gut is, well, how can that inform? But I think that might be what you do, is think, how can that inform? What about building community, or racism or sexism or classism back then informs how we understand and deal with those issues today or in the future?
I mean, I think one really interesting question that for me has always been vexing is that, except for a certain period when AIDS was in fact deadly before the cocktails came about, and now to a certain extent with the whole marriage sort of there really hasn't been much of a change in terms of how the gay community approaches sex. Very few people have talked about it, as far as I've heard. And to me, in one sense, that's one huge lesson that would be very beneficial for the community, which really has not been approached.
And next.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this brief. I want to pick up on the idea of best practices, and it occurred to me that that it's always useful to look at the present, to think about the future, because if we're not dealing with things in the present, then what we're talking about fantasy. We're not really dealing with real people's lives. And it occurs to me in listening to Tony Silvestri's talk that in fact, you provide a best practice about using oral history as outreach, as a mechanism to provide information to the whole community, particularly if this pattern of what's happening with the youth, we got the same rate, and there hasn't been a real impact in terms of information and change of behavior and stuff, that this is an opportunity to really engage people in the here and now and use it as a way to disseminate the information we have today. Because some of the emotional, spiritual, psychological impact is still there. People are still dealing with relationships with families and everything else. Thank God we have something that can keep this disease at bay for a while. But I think it's important to think about using whatever oral history as a way to do outreach. The other things I just want to applaud, Tara, your comment about being inclusive is so important. I think that the issue about women and HIV and understanding the connection for women with drugs is very, very critical. When I was at director of the Women's Center at Penn, we worked with a number of city groups to really do community summits called on women, drugs, and AIDS, and to really try to say it's not just about gay men. Yes, it is about gay men, but there are other communities affected in different kinds of ways that also need to be included when we think outreach, when we think treatment, when we think prevention, when we think the future, where we're going to go with it. And then, and the other thing is to make sure that in that inclusion, in fact, the story of women are in there. One of the things that happened early on, from my recollection, being involved in the lesbian feminist community and women's health, is that a lot of us who work in abortion clinics and rape crisis centers, etc., were also there being buddies. We're also there helping develop a lot of structures that now we're seeing as part of, in some ways, the white gay male community, when in fact there were many people working in lots of different communities, and it was about us coming together. That really needs to be documented too, because I think that there were lots of lessons learned about setting up active women's shelters that were useful, in terms of confidentiality, in terms of other issues. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
And you just made me think a lot of, if you look at the history of oral history, people talk about stories around the campfire, that have been going on for, thousands of years potentially, and those stories generally weren't just to tell a story. There was a lesson or a point to them as well. And so before we go to the third person in the row, I just want to say, I'm going to pass around, it says Oral History Project sign up. I hope we have emails already from most of you or addresses, but I recently I formed a gay organization 30 years ago when I was doing AIDS Awareness Week and whatever, and I actually found all my documents this week and 2 weeks ago and donated them to Penn, but in there was a sign-up sheet from the first meeting. And I thought, we don't have sign-up sheets anymore. It's like, I had everyone's name and phone number. And I remember they didn't even have answering machines, so you'd have to keep calling until they
Now they have answering machines and they screen their calls.
Right, so this is actually for history. The sign-up sheet. So I don't have a pen. If we can pass this around and someone can find a pen. This is so we can keep in contact with anyone, because we're not going to answer all the issues, or all the questions today, but we want to get this project going. So,
I wanted to make 2 points. One was that I think if we think about doing an oral history, we should include and possibly prioritize information that's not going to be able to be remembered otherwise. So, for example, I was on a panel last night in this conference and went to a website called News Library, which is a compendium of newspaper articles going back to the 70s primarily. And I searched for Philadelphia and AIDS, and there was something like 4,000 articles. And that's just newspapers, it wasn't magazines, it wasn't really very much from outside of Philadelphia. I'm sure it was probably written about Philadelphia and other places. And it occurred to me that there is, for a historian, that's a treasure trove of information. There's a lot of information about what happened in the progress of the AIDS epidemic and the response to it, that while not unimportant to an oral history, is not as important to the oral history related to what Tyrone's talking about, where a lot of that was not being recorded anywhere. A lot of the experience, especially in the early days, of African American gay men and AIDS was not being recorded anywhere. And so we have to hurry up because there's a number of those people still around that can give us that history, and we're not going to find it in the News Library website. The other point I was trying to make, which I forget, was that I think this relates to something that Hesha was saying, or somebody was saying. What was unique, one of the many things that was unique about the struggles around AIDS was that a relatively disenfranchised, powerless people developed the power to influence the healthcare system and government and the way people think about the community that was relatively disenfranchised and powerless. So I think stories and people who can talk about what happened to bring us together to assert that power, which I don't believe has, in terms of a health concern, had happened any time before in history or has happened since. You know, we have, why isn't there a movement around people with addiction having the impact that people with AIDS had? There's a reason for that, and I don't know exactly what it is, but I think if we hear from the people who made that movement happen, that we'll learn something we'll learn something from history that might empower us to do some other things in the future.
You have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, it occurs to me that most of the discussion has been about political or policy purposes of a project like this, and wondering what happened to human interest stories, inspirational stories of, I don't know, how a union activist ended up having a prior relationship with the mayor and how that relationship ended up impacting how the epidemic was dealt with in the city, or there are any number of stories about how gay people who previously worked in other fields have now risen to become influential policy people because of their connection with the HIV epidemic. A good example is, I'll just use an example and embarrass a friend of mine named Michael Vincent, who was a dancer when I first met him. He's now a PhD candidate. That all happened because of AIDS. No policy lesson there, there's no political lesson there, but there's a lesson of how working within a system of public health makes gay men, for example, go to meetings at the White House that we never would have gone to. And in fact, we have jobs in the White House and we sit on panels that have no relationship with HIV because of the relationships we made through working on HIV. So I guess I was looking for a human interest side and inspirational side that wasn't necessarily political or policy related.
But again, I think, and I agree with you guys, but there was also another part. I think that for me, when I look at this whole thing, I look at how, as black men, we were able to garner support of black straight men, like Ernie Jones, who was a very powerful person at the Urban Affairs Coalition, who took, at that time it wasn't cute to do it, and it wasn't politically necessarily the thing to do for black men, but was able to embrace it, to bring 3 factions under the umbrella of the Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition: the Hispanic community, the Asian community, the African American community, and they were all gay groups, but they all came, so it was the fabric at that time was that people wanted to help. So it wasn't just gay folks, it was straight people as well that helped to move the movement forward. And I think that when we have those kinds of conversations and have that kind of dialogue, it opens the door for other folks who are in powerful positions to be as sensitive. Just look at the mayor at that time, Mayor Wilson Good, a straight minister man, but was able to do what he was able to do. So I think that, and sometimes when you hear it from folks that look like you, or tell the story about us, then it sensitizes other folks that look like us to say, oh yeah, it's okay.
I just want to definitely agree with the gentleman in the beige in the back. I think that one of the reasons why I would advocate for the early years of HIV really being documented is because there's information there that's critically important to this activist movement right now. I'm a person who lives with systemic lupus erythematosus, and 40% of people with systemic lupus are Black. And so when we look at diseases and we look at the trajectory of diseases, why have it? And it's also an immune system condition, right? Doctors know the least about the immune system. And lots of immune system disorders disproportionately affect Black people, right? And so there's a real wealth of knowledge that activists who organize around HIV/AIDS have to teach other people with disproportionately oppressive diseases, right? And who are living with diseases that could be better managed by the government, who are being forgotten by the medical industrial complex, and who are living with the impact of that every day, right? Also, as a chapter lead for Black Lives Matter Philadelphia, there's a humongous just wealth of activism that happened in this city among Black people, among brown people, that younger activists don't know anything about, but also like, where do we go to know it, right? You know, like there's a lot of like critique of younger folks, like for not knowing your history, you don't know it, but also like the effort wasn't necessarily made to write it down, and also a lot of people died, you know, like folks died before they were able to record their story, like folks, you know, were kept in oppressive situations where, you know, you had to work, you had to do another thing, you know, and you weren't getting interviewed by TV, and you weren't writing a book, you know, and so we were left with a very selective memory to choose from. I think that if we start with folks who were there at the beginning and worked our way towards the present, I don't think we lose anything. Like, we can do both. You know, like people have a variety of interests, and the core that would be assembled would hopefully have a diversity of skill sets that they can bring to both projects. And hopefully it would be something that temporally lasted a while, so that different time periods in the movement could be collected.
So I'm hearing several different themes, but one of them is this, you know, how people take power, or, you know, are put into a situation and do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise or normally, and how they, you know, they rise up in such a situation.
I want to ask Tyrone a question, because there was something somebody asked me years ago about the faith community. Because I know Philadelphia Fight has an excellent faith community department there. But I was wondering, in the early days of the faith community, we know of a lot of people who have passed away from this situation. What was your impact of dealing with so many notable names in the faith community, and how did you deal with it when it first happened? In the early days?
Let me be real clear with you,
Yeah.
and this is very honest. In the early days, there was no church inviting you in to do nothing. Okay? But for us, and I'm going to call names, Charlotte White, he started out with Babashi, they can help me out. Curtis Waddington, there was a church up in North Philadelphia, run by a woman, Mother Mead, and we would go in there on Tuesday nights, after we had been over the weekend and in and out of hospitals, and we would have prayer. It was a Black church on Girard Avenue, right across the street from St. Joe's Hospital. That was the only place of refuge that we could go. And she would pray for us who were doing the work. Because when you saw so many dying people, it takes, and these are your friends, it takes an effect on you emotionally and so forth. And the other thing is, you know, like people today, when we used to, hugging today has become so the thing to do. But in the early days, when we walked into a club or a bar and somebody would walk up to you and hug you, they would hug you until your breathing was insane. Seriously. Because that was a place of refuge and where you could feel that. I mean, so I mean, just to have those kinds of conversations, those were some of the things that we did. And now everybody takes it for granted. Oh, that's hi, how you doing? Ugly. No, it doesn't do it for me, and it annoys me. Because I remember when hugging was sacred and a very spiritual kind of thing. I think you can witness to that as well. It was real. But yeah, that was the only church that we could go to.
I mean, one of the things that's always fascinated me is sort of LGBT people put up with back then, or consider wonderful. I mean, when a church would say, we love you despite your choices, we were like, yay. When a politician would tell a friend that they had a gay friend, we would vote for that person because they had a gay friend. Or when we went in, we saw a doctor and they didn't throw us out, we would say that was good care.
Right.
Because we expected to be thrown out when we found out that we were gay. So we had these lower expectations, and I love to see this evolving expectations over the years, what we expect of all these institutions, but questions.
Well, I actually want to sort of endorse David Fair's suggestion of at least one focus, though it strikes me that this probably would be a focus that's more relevant to covering the early years. But I must say, when AIDS came on the scene in the time that it did, I thought it could be the end of the movement, right? I mean, we were so unpopular already, and now we are diseased and going to give our disease to all these poor innocent straight people. I mean, what could be more the kiss of death of gay liberation? And then here we are, having seen it take really almost the opposite form, and it's quite stunning to me, and not altogether clear how that happened. So I think that would be a really fascinating exploration.
I would also like to push a thought around, I think it's super important to document the activism, but I also think it's really important to document the everyday voices and experiences of people living with HIV and AIDS. And I think focusing on the early years is, just time-wise would be really important. But I also just want to make sure that we're cognizant of, if we're only focusing on activist voices, then who is being left out of the conversation. And so I want us to be thinking about that as we're thinking of who we're targeting and those kinds of things. So it's important to document the activism, but also, and what are some of the everyday pieces of resistance, and what does that look like? And if we're defining activism in one way, that really shuts us off from looking at what other kinds of things were happening.
Well, and just to say, to your point, looking at people living with HIV in terms of how to look at chronic disease self-management, how to learn best practices around the care and management of chronic disease, I think is really important in terms of healthy living with HIV or with lupus or with anything. So really looking at the disease self-management piece, I think would be really important.
Yeah, and there is, it's very limited, but there's an ACT UP Oral History project. So there is, that's a very small part of activism, but there are some activist groups that have had oral histories. NIH actually has an oral history project. Actually has embraced the fact that people were storming it back then and has collected those histories. So yes.
I think I'm with what everybody else has said about this, but the evolution of what is happening is very relevant, and how some of this, what has happened 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, is starting to come back to being relevant. Now that this disease is not a priority, it's a chronic disease that they feel is not as important. Just recently, Congress is fighting over whether or not to take funding from AIDS research to Alzheimer's research. They're fighting with us, talking about, well, it's not that important anymore. Well, we have young people getting sick with this, so it is very relevant. So to talk about the evolution of where this is going and how we are stepping back is important. Just last week, we at Penn is putting together this leadership development package that all Center for AIDS researchers in the country want us at Penn to help them develop a template for leadership development. And we were actually sitting back talking about, how do you put that together? And we started talking about the history of this AIDS, of this epidemic. And we started talking about there's no true direction to go, because one of the gentlemen that was sitting there talked about the indigenous people and how we don't have indigenous people on our board anymore. And I can say, actually, we do have, they have evolved from being not educated enough to understand, to being very well educated, who also have the disease, who also meet certain criteria, and how it went from a white male illness to now majority minority illness, and how these things have changed how we look at the priorities. So we have to talk about the evolution, where it was, what has changed, how it went from a disease that needed to be handled right now to a disease as behavior, and now it's not relevant enough to put the funding in. So we have to look at those laws. There are certain states that have laws put in place to make it criminalized so that you do not want to go and get tested. You have states that refuse to require you when you come in to see if you have the disease inside you so that you get it taken care of. So we have to look at those things as well. And that's also part of the oral history, the archives, so that our young people understand this. We can't just talk about the past and not try to help them understand, but also bring them to the table to say, what do you want from us? So if the panel can talk about that, that would be great.
I think that's for me why I think it's really important to think about, where do we want this to live and what format do we want it to live in? And thinking about, I would really love for people who are coming into the AIDS library every day to be able to access these oral histories in some kind of way, to be really thinking about, for whom are these available? Is it available just for researchers, for academics, or even just, activists who think to go seek out this information, or is it really available to folks today who are most impacted by the disease? And so I think the format matters a lot. That's important.
I agree. I think that, everyone's experience is unique. You can't make a blanket statement and say, what worked then, work now. Socioeconomics, class, race, how people are infected, how people practice safer sex. I mean, it's all different. And so you really have to, you have to know who you want to impact and get them to the table and have conversations with them about what matters to you now. So because what matters to you now, that's what I want to see in an oral history project, because that is what will influence me in terms of when I walk out of that room, having heard that oral history project, can I say, well, that most looks like me. That most looks like me, and I can change the way I'm behaving, I can change the way I believe, the way I feel. I can change. And so that's what we want to impact, is change in behavior through oral history.
And in that same vein, just thinking about best practices, like there are certain structures that I think that both people who participate in it, folks who are living and wouldn't necessarily consider themselves activists, and also activists have to impart for folks just generally, right? Like I think that there's not a lot of scholarship just generally on buyers clubs, and like the folks who were involved in those, are increasingly getting older, and in addition, I think about the way that libraries are going to use oral histories, right? Like, so I'm definitely a librarian, and for our library, we have the collection of the Critical Path Project newsletter, right? So we have years and years of that. Well, it talks a lot about buyers clubs, but we don't have that a lot of other places in our collection, right? So it gives librarians and libraries a chance to supplement their collections in meaningful ways. I also think of some of our books talk about collectives of PIST, right? People with immune system disorders, and this like inter-issue organizing, That's not something that's so heavily taken up now, Like that is something that we need guidelines on, and also it's really marketable, that can be in a lot of different ways. So when you collect meaningfully, I think that if you have a library that just talks about women, like you should probably have things that talk about trans women, right? So you get to add that to your collection and add information about women living with HIV and AIDS in meaningful ways. So I think that, especially when we figure out what is it that we don't have a lot of scholarship around, what do we not have a lot of resources around? If we find a lot of information about, say, bars, which we do have a lot of things about, who was the bars, who was in a certain club, like what was Act Up doing? We have a lot of that information. What we have less about is those everyday acts of resistance, right, that people engaged in just to stay alive, and the way that people reached across different communities in order to make their lives work. And I don't think that'll go out of style. I think that will always be relevant.
Perfect example. I think that one of the things I remember most is with ACO and with folks that worked over there, they gave up their days for brothers that were there that were ill. They gave up their vacation days so that somebody could be, that kind of, and they were straight folks, and they were white and black folks. And I think when we start to show that interaction of white folks, black folks, Hispanic folks, just folks who were supportive of the movement and taking care of somebody because they knew them personally, they worked with them. I think that kind of cross-bridging of communities is so important as we're moving forward. Because gay folks right now, it's cool. It's okay to be. We can get married. It's okay. From back from where I came from, it might not be perfect. And I think, at least I mean, the hell that we went through. You understand what I'm saying? So I think that when you can show that interaction of many communities together, how that we're all human beings and we can care for each other, have that kind of stuff. I think that's the meat of it. For me, that's a part of the meat of it.
So I'll say, I would love to keep talking. We might have a few more minutes.
I have an elementary question. Where is the AIDS library located? Is it in the William Way building?
No.
Oh, okay, I don't have any idea then.
It's right across the street, 1233 Locust, so it's the other corner of Locust and 13.
And the murals.
With the mural, the same building as the mural, second floor.
1233 Locust.
1233, second floor, yep.
So we only have a few more minutes. I still think, I'm not a process person, I hate process. I just like to do stuff. That said, I think this is the type of thing you have to think before you do it. There has to be some process, thinking about what you actually want to accomplish and then how you want to accomplish it. We haven't even, I don't think we've finished like what we want to accomplish. I think we're getting a lot of good ideas and getting close to that, but then we have to actually think about how to do it. And I don't want to dictate any of this. This has to come from us. So, yeah.
I think it's very how participatory this has been, and really challenged us with something very big right from the start. AIDS is so personal for all of us, and yet so complicated, and it brings in so many other topics. It's huge. So how does one focus? Does one think about what we want to present, or does one think about who the audience for this project would be? Who do we imagine watching it or listening to it to be? Is it possible to emphasize personal histories, but also best practices, or are those two different archival projects?
Let's keep talking. I wanted to try to go ahead.
Just since it's 4:59 Eastern by the clock, actually, if there's a way we can think about a process to continue this conversation.
Right, and that's what I was trying to do. Yes, I agree. And I want to hear what works best for people. I know this is difficult to do stuff like this, but we do have contact information for people that are interested. We have people, I'm sure, contact information for anyone at the conference, so we can also inform them that something's happening. But who wants to take charge of this? I mean, Drexel is willing to actually provide some resources to do some of the interviewing and stuff like that, but I don't necessarily want to be I can't be, I don't want to be. I could be. But we have to figure out a way forward, and the next discussion. There's different ways we can plan another meeting to get together to talk about this. I know that talking about stuff online can be difficult. Drexel, we could, you won't understand what I mean, we could set up a Blackboard shell. I can make that unmysterious, but a way where a place that you can deposit it. I know there's severe limitations, but it's a place that you can deposit materials and show people stuff and think and have discussions online, so people don't have to come together for this 1 hour on a certain day. So we can do that. I'm just throwing it out there as something, as a way to proceed, or in addition to ways that we proceed.
I mean, the AIDS Library can also be a space where we can get together and have, I don't know if there's going to be an advisory board or some kind of committee around this, but I mean, the AIDS Library would love to be very involved in this project as well.
Could you volunteer to at least just convene the next meeting?
Yes.
Because I think that's about as much as we can expect to really get done.
Okay.
We're going to convene something
We're
else.
going to convene a meeting.
Right, okay, so we're gonna convene a meeting, we'll get some notes to you, we'll try to share what resources are currently available, and, next steps then after that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I'd be involved.
What?
I would love to be involved in this. I think a lot of
Sign
sign, yeah.
The sheet, yeah, make sure you get it, because that's for history, that'll be learned.
So what information is on the sign-in sheet? Does it include phone numbers and email addresses? Email. So we should probably also get phone numbers, particularly for folks who are less.
Well, I said email or phone.
Okay.
It didn't have, but I don't know what people wrote. But.
And is anyone who put on the sign-in sheet interested in continuing this conversation and being invited to future?
If so, here you can check that.
Is there anyone who signed up who is not interested?
Hopefully you signed up because you're.
Okay. Consent and all is important.
So I know we now, it's 500, so I think we're done.
Yeah, let's hear it for this group.